Welcome to the third lecture in the Renaissance series. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the High Renaissance. In our two previous lectures, we discussed an overview of the Renaissance and some of the architecture. And then in the second one, we talked about some of the amazing things that were happening in painting and in sculpting during that early Renaissance period. And now we're moving into the High Renaissance. Now, the High Renaissance occurred between 1485 and 1490. This was an age of exploration. People wanted to discover more about the world. They weren't focused just on themselves and their societies. They were wanting to get out and discover more about the world. They relied on tools that were developed in the Middle Ages. For example, there's an astrolabe or labe that helped sailors determine latitude. The magnetic compass helped determine direction. Maps included new information, so they were extremely useful for wanting to explore and get out into the world. And ships were improved. They were powered by sails. Trade was also very important during this time. In addition to it being this age of exploration, it also was an age during which trade became a huge part of society. So this is that period of time where we're going to really be exploring some phenomenal artists. These are going to be names that you've heard of before, like Leonardo da Vinci, who is considered the ultimate in the Renaissance man concept. Raphael, Michelangelo. Again, we've already talked about Donatello, and now you've got Leonardo, Raphael, and Michelangelo. This is a wonderful period, and there's so much creativity and intellect and ingenuity that goes into this time period. You can see, a map of the period. You see Florence here, which had been the hub, and you see the rest of Italy. Italy has become this very large place. All right, so the first artist we're going to talk about is the famous Leonardo da Vinci. He's considered a Renaissance man, and in fact, this term has been coined during this time period, and it is going to be used throughout the rest of history. If someone is a Renaissance man, this is a well-rounded man. This is a man that is able, or a person, I should say, that is able to do so many different things in so many different areas. They've conquered so many different ideals and have been inventive in so many different areas. They're not just known for one thing. So when we think about Leonardo da Vinci, and there is a portrait painting of him, we think of him as a painter, but we also think of him as a sculptor, an architect, an engineer, a biologist, a geologist, a geographer, and an inventor. Now, that's a lot of hats to wear, and he wore them all well. He believed beauty could be obtained through the use of geometry and arithmetic, perspective, and especially natural observation. And you'll remember that I made reference to him in the previous lecture and said that we would be looking at one of his famous paintings, The Last Supper, and we'll do that during this lecture series. He was known for his drawings of how things would work. He would draw potential inventions. He would take the Vitruvian Man and, absolutely consider how the body would move when it would go to these different angles and these different movements. So Leonardo da Vinci is just amazing. When we talk about his painting, he had a very innovative approach of combining science and art, which is not something we see before this time period and before this person. This idea that painting isn't just about, creating this image from memory or from a subject or whatever, and it just being a very creative process, he brought science and math into the equation, if you will. This is one of his famous paintings, Madonna on the Rocks. The full title of the painting is The Virgin with the Infant St. John the Baptist adoring the Christian child, accompanied by an angel. You can see why we call it Madonna on the Rocks. Now, he had this belief that beauty could be attained through natural observation, and that it's seen in the accuracy of the plants and the stalagmites and the stalactites in the dark grotto. So in this painting, we have all of the natural elements of this location. So he's very true to um, realistic kind of natural occurrences. So if he's going to place his subjects of the painting in a certain location, he's going to include the flora and the fauna, the plants, the animals, whatever would have been natural to that location. So it's not just about the subjects of the painting, but it's also about the reality of what would be present from the natural world. Again, bringing in that science. So you see in this, you've got Mary, okay? And these are two different renditions of this painting, all right? But you've got Mary, you've also got over on this side, the child holding the cross, right? And you've got baby Jesus over here. Here is John the Baptist, and you have his mother over here. Actually, sorry, I just absolutely blurted for a minute. You've got Mary and Jesus. Jesus is holding the cross, and then you've got Elizabeth and baby John on this side. Okay, so this is an oil on canvas. You do notice a lot of the plants that would be natural to this location, stalactites, stalagmites, all the things you'd expect to see in that dark grotto. Now, Leonardo da Vinci, when we think of him, we have to talk about the use of light. He did not like direct sunlight when he was painting. He wanted more of a soft, diffused light that you might find in the early morning or late in the day, or bad weather. He loved to paint in those low light situations, and bad weather provided that opportunity. He had two painting techniques that he developed. One was the chiaroscuro, which is clear and obscure, or light and shadow, in which light picks out what the artist wants the viewer to see, while shadow hides the other parts. Another famous technique was called the sfumato. It translates as smoky. This outlines the blend with the background, creating a slightly hazy effect to that background, suggesting that objects are surrounded by the atmosphere. So those are two of those techniques that are important concerning light in Leonardo da Vinci. One of his most famous paintings, as we mentioned, is The Last Supper. Now, this is a huge mural, and a lot of interesting painting technique is used in this painting. Rather than a fresco bueno, which is a good fresco, he used a technique of painting on wet lime plaster with a mixture of pigment and water. He painted on dry plaster with oil, tempera, and possibly also fresco. The adhesion was very poor, and the painting began to deteriorate while he was still working on it. All right. So let's take a look at this painting. All right. Now, we've seen so many variations of this painting. This one is fresco, oil, and tempera on plaster, as we mentioned. Um, Jesus is in the center of the bilaterally symmetrical composition. Okay, there are three windows behind him, the largest of which is the middle, and of course Jesus is in the center of that, framing and emphasizing him. It almost provides like a halo for him. Now he's got six apostles on each side of him. They're divided into four groups of three for balance. So here's three, here are three. Here's three, here's three. Jesus forms an equilateral triangle. All perspective lines converge toward him, thereby directing the viewer's eyes to him, which merges form and content. Now, we talked about how Leonardo da Vinci, infused the use of math and of science in his in his works, and geometry being one of those. So again, we've talked about the triangle. Notice the tablecloth is made up of rectangles put together evenly. You've got these panels along the side, on each side. Everything has symmetry, everything is balanced, but you've got rectangles, you've got the windows rectangle. Look at the ceiling, you've got an interesting geometric pattern there as well. And you do have this symmetry and balance between the number of people on each side. So just fascinating, the things that someone who has an interest in more than just painting brings to the mix. And Leonardo da Vinci definitely brings more to the mix. Another one of his famous paintings is called the Mona Lisa. Sometimes it's called La Gioconda. There is an interest during the Renaissance in the individual. And there's been questions over the years of who was this Mona Lisa. I'm going to show you a picture. There's a picture of the painting, the Mona Lisa. This is painted with oil on a wood panel, or wood canvas. And this one's actually in the Louvre in Paris. All right, so the sitter, the person that's the subject, is thought to be Lisa d'Antonio Maria Girardina, who's the 24-year-old wife of Francesco del Gioconda, who was an official in France. Mona Lisa appears relaxed and natural. It's not a bust-length profile. What we were seeing before this were bust-length profiles, but we get a three-quarter length view with this painting, and it's set against a landscape background. Again, not a standard. So take a look at this. Notice a bust profile would have just cut off about, at her bust, literally, okay? But it is that three-quarters profile, which is new. We actually see the hands. Notice she's got the high forehead. You can see the line where the hair used to be, and then all of the hair has been plucked above that. You've also got that landscape in the background that we were talking about that appeared during this period. Instead of her just sitting with nothing in the background, there's actually a landscape, which adds to the depth of the painting. Remember, we saw the profile portrait of the two individuals, the guy with the wart and his wife, and we had the landscape behind there. So this is something that we're seeing in this time period. And here we've got, again, the three-quarters length profile versus, or portrait versus just a bust type portrait. There's the big question that's been asked about this painting. Does she smile or is she sad? And there's been a case made for both sides. Just adds to the intrigue of this painting. Now, this Leonardo did a lot of drawings. They were pen and ink drawings. And this is one of those. This one's called Vitruvian Man. This is 13.5 inches by 9 5/8 inches. Notice again, it was a study in the movement of the body, and how the muscles would look if the body was moved. So here we have one stance, here we have a different stance, and the movement of the arms upward. So again, notice the symmetry. Everything's equal, good mirror image on muscle mass and things such as that. He did a lot of drawings of the body, of trying to discover how something works, or um, why something is the way that it is. Answers for things, scientific, biological answers. He's also done a lot of his inventions and things such as that. Here's another one of his pen and ink drawings. Um, this was called Embryo in the Womb. This was pen and brown ink, 11 3/4 inch by 8.5 inches. Notice the detail of the baby inside the womb of a woman, and out to the side he would have like enlarged drawings of some little intricate part inside. Here you have the uterine lining, and a discussion here of what he has discovered by doing this. So just some phenomenal things by Da Vinci. Another famous artist that we know from this period is Raphael. Now, unlike Da Vinci, whose approach to art was scientific, Raphael sought charm and grace and ideal beauty. So his focus is definitely different than Da Vinci's. His compositions are notable for their clarity, their harmony, their unity of design. Raphael only lived 37 years. So another artist who died very young. He's considered, though, the epitome of the high Renaissance ideals. So even in the short period of time, he has made a great impact, and represents so much of what we think of when we think of the high Renaissance ideals. He was especially praised for his portrayals of Mary and her infant son, and in and he also was a very fine portraitist. Now, here's some of Raphael's work, a very famous piece of his work. This is a fresco that's actually in the Vatican in Rome. Pope Julius II is the one that commissioned Raphael to fresco several rooms in the Vatican in Rome. So the subjects for the paintings were determined by the Pope. And they concerned the 4 areas of learning. So, law and justice is the title of one of them, and this represents the cardinal virtues. The arts is the subject of another one of the frescoes, and it depicts Mount Parnassus. Another subject for a fresco was theology, and it was called Dispute over the Sacrament. And then the last one was philosophy, and it was called, that painting fresco was called the School of Athens, and that's really one of his most famous pieces, is the School of Athens. And you see it on this wall here. I've got a different one for you to see. Now, here on the right, you can see the entire School of Athens painting, the fresco. It's on the wall. But notice how it looks as if you could walk into this painting and walk all the way back out the back end of the painting. It's as if you can look above you and you see the barrel vaulted ceiling and the design of that. You see the steps, you see the floor detail, you see this archway here. It just really feels like it's a 3-dimensional piece and not on a flat surface. There are artists whose likenesses Raphael borrowed in order to depict his classical heroes. So the stately bearded Plato is an idealized portrait of Leonardo. Okay, so this is supposed to be Plato, but he placed an idealized image of himself. All right. The balding Euclid is seen bending over his slate. All right here. Um, he resembles Raphael's good friend, the architect Bramante. In the far right corner of the painting, Raphael himself, um, wearing a dark hat and looking at the viewer, appears discreetly among the Aristotelians. So here you had, Raphael puts Leonardo's image, okay, in his painting, right? Kind of interesting because Plato is, known historically for his philosophy, just like Leonardo is a wise old guy when it comes to painting, right? And then you get Raphael's good friend, the architect, depicted here as Euclid. And then we've got Raphael, the right corner. Raphael himself, wearing a dark hat and looking at the viewer, appears discreetly among the Aristotelians. Okay, so here you go, all right, with Raphael. So they might take classical um, people like Plato to have in this painting, which is about the school of Athens. So, of course, these people would be present. But again, with that Renaissance idea of making them current, making them new, making them reborn, and putting in those faces of important people to the Renaissance period in this piece that is set in the um, Athenian time, right? So, kind of interesting, right? This is a famous piece called Madonna of the Meadows, also called the Alba Madonna. Jesus's future is prefigured by the cross offered by the infant John and accepted by Jesus. This is typical of the High Renaissance. The subject is directly presented and easily grasped. The figures are convincingly solid and three-dimensional. Generous proportions of Mary and the chubbiness of the child are similar to those ancient Roman sculptures, but this was a source of inspiration for Renaissance artists. And this is oil on wood, is the medium that was used. Softer features, right? Less harsh, beautiful uses of light and flowy nature in the background. Another famous artist of the Renaissance is Michelangelo. He was an architect, an engineer, a sculptor, a painter, a poet. He wasn't interested in the science of Leonardo da Vinci, and he wasn't interested in the charm and gentle grace of Raphael. He was fascinated by the human body, especially the male nude. That same Pope who had commissioned Raphael to do the frescoes on the walls in the Vatican is also the one who commissions Michelangelo to fresco his famous ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. Now, it took 4 years to complete this ceiling. You've got this painting that's 5,760 square feet of the ceiling of the Vatican Sistine Chapel. He worked on a scaffold, all right, poised 70 feet above the floor for hours and days on end. His back was just destroyed after this. Now, you see the beautiful, beautiful paintings. And this was such a well planned out painting. You've got the paintings in this center part. You've got paintings along the sides. And it illustrates the creation and fall of humankind. There are 9 principal scenes, as well as in the hundreds of accompanying prophets and sibyls. He used high-keyed, clear, bright colors, which really just makes this whole area of this Sistine Chapel just pop with color. He maximized the grandeur of figures that seem superhuman in size and in spirit. On this slide, you see a plan. He had a plan of the narrative program for the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So you can see that we've got the separation of light from darkness. So we've got creation, okay? All the way through the drunkenness of Noah in this center portion. Then you've got some famous people as part of the stories, like David and Goliath, Moses and the serpent. You've got death of Haman. You've got the prophets, okay, or some key figures, Daniel, Isaiah. So this wasn't just random. This was a well thought out commissioning and piece of work. Here is a close-up of the one called The Creation of Adam. All right. And so you've got this beautiful story of God and the angels giving life to Adam, this human that he had created. Michelangelo's not just known for his paintings, and he's done some beautiful work. And the Sistine Chapel is just like the grand piece of and legacy that he leaves behind, but his sculpture of one of the most famous statues in history. This is Michelangelo's David. This is sculpted completely out of marble. It is 13 feet high, 5 inches. You can actually take a little virtual tour and see. Now notice this is Michelangelo deliberately violates classical proportions by making the head and the hands of this figure too large for the trunk. So if you look at the trunk of this body and you look at the size of these hands and head, they're not proportionate. And he does this deliberately. Notice the muscle fine tuning of the muscles and all of the intricate details of the muscles and the knees, the feet, the body itself. You see a close-up of the hand on the left part of the slide. In the middle, you see a close-up of his legs and his feet. The feet don't look like they match the size of the hands. The hands are just extremely large. Beautiful artwork, though. Such attention to detail. And again, marble's not the easiest thing to carve from. So when we think about the legacy of the Renaissance, because remember, so much of what we do with our textbook is about the landmarks and the legacy that's left behind from a certain time period and the people of the period. There's definitely been a paradigm shift. There's the changing of the very perception of what it means to be human. So some changes we see in the Renaissance. The Renaissance changed the way people thought of themselves, the way they thought of their surroundings, and the way they thought of their religion. We had left that Middle Ages period where religion was everything, and now, people have more freedom of choice, and there's more to their lives than just their religion. Some of the changes, independent thought and the beginning of an empirical science that would result in the eventual scientific revolution of the 17th century. So people are thinking for themselves, and they're beginning to question and wonder and try to find answers in science. There's the notion of the individual self that has emerged, not just the individual in reference to others and what's expected, but the individual as a person. And there's the perspective in art was created, that linear perspective or any of the other perspectives. Musical notation was improved. There's literary development such as the sonnet. Remember that Petrarch sonnet emerged. We had wonderful pieces of literature that were being developed. Boccaccio's Decameron, Canterbury Tales, so many others that are showing that change in literature. Developments in painting and sculpture are definitely happening in the Renaissance, and they paved the way for the major achievements of the masters of the High Renaissance. The High Renaissance saw the spread of all of these qualities to other places because as people are traveling more, they're taking all of this knowledge with them, all this creativity with them. And even more masterful pieces of art are created during this High Renaissance in the form of, sculpture and paintings. People like Leonardo da Vinci, the Renaissance man, and Michelangelo, Raphael, all of these greats that because the way has been paved for them during the earlier Renaissance and earlier periods, they're just taking and running with it and creating some phenomenal pieces of artwork. This concludes our lecture series on the Renaissance. Thank you for joining me.